Our next presenter is Indigenous Food Sovereignty in Urban Indigenous Communities, Stories of Land and Connection within Kingston and Waterloo-Wellington regions in Ontario.
Hey, bonjour, Caitlin Dijnakas, Mung Nadodam, Matawin Ndojaba, Elgin, and Diane. My name is Dr. Caitlin Patterson, and I'm a mixed ancestry Algonquin from the Loon Clan from Mattawa. I'm a postdoc fellow at the University of Waterloo, working on a project entitled Indigenous Food Sovereignty in Urban Indigenous Communities, Stories of Land and Connection within Kingston and Waterloo-Wellington region, Ontario, Canada. The Cataraqui team is Sheldon Travis, Maureen Buchanan, and Autumn Watson. They participate in Indigenous food sovereignty initiatives in the area. The formal partner organization for this research in Kingston is All Our Relations Land Trust, which provides Indigenous-led environmental stewardship to the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden in Kingston. Waterloo-Wellington team members are Hannah Tate Neufeld, Elizabeth Miltenburg, Dave Skene, Laura Peach, and Serena Perchak. They are all members of the Wisahkotewinowak Collective, which is an urban Indigenous garden collective that builds land-based relationships across the Grand River Territory. Shout out to Wasak over there. A bit of background that has brought us to our work on Indigenous food sovereignty is an acknowledgement that colonialism has disconnected Indigenous peoples from the land and their food systems. And Indigenous food sovereignty is a movement that emphasizes meaningful connections or reconnections within food systems. Indigenous food sovereignty also involves active participation in decision-making around where and how food is grown, harvested, cooked, eaten, and cared for, and it involves accessing, protecting, and maintaining Indigenous lands and waters for the regeneration of food sources ongoing. Another issue is the fact that urban Indigenous communities in Canada experience unique barriers to land that are not well understood by policymakers or the general public. For example, the constant threat of development or having no federally recognized governance, and yet over half of the Indigenous population in Canada lives in urban areas. But despite targeted separations from land and the particular barriers that exist in urban settings, Indigenous peoples are able to find ways to be on the land, to practice Indigenous food sovereignty, and continue or rekindle meaningful relationships with the land and waters. For example, Wasak and White Owl Natives Ancestry Association, another Indigenous-led organization from the area, lead food, forest, and medicine gardens, steward a maple sugar bush, run a food sharing and food basket program, and organize land-based food and cultural workshops and events. In Kingston, Indigenous peoples steward an Indigenous food sovereignty garden and 2 little forests. The garden has been running for 3 years, and the forests were planted in 2021 and spring 2023. Kingston Native Center and Language Nest also leads a variety of food and land-based programs for the community. Knowing that Indigenous relationships with land are flourishing in urban spaces, we wanted to explore through this research primarily how are urban Indigenous collectives able to be on the land for food sovereignty activities despite the barriers they face. This project explores these questions through community-based participatory research. It uses storytelling through sharing circles and one-on-one interviews with Indigenous peoples from Cataraqui and Waterloo-Wellington region. I'm also taking field notes and reviewing relevant documents, for example, municipal policies that are relevant to food sovereignty. The study invites self-identifying Indigenous adults 18 years and older who are involved with Indigenous food sovereignty initiatives in their urban communities, as well as their non-Indigenous allies. By email, I'm reaching out to people with whom Hannah and I have pre-existing relationships, and also recruiting through snowball sampling. I started data collection 2 weeks ago, and I've held 2 circles and 1 interview in Cataraqui so far. Of the 9 participants I've spoken with, 7 are men and 2 are women, 2 are men, 5 are Indigenous, Mohawk, Anishinaabe, Métis, and 4 are settlers. The average age of participants is 64 years, with a range of 45 to 86 years. I'd like to share some preliminary findings from 1 circle, including 5 participants, 4 of whom are Indigenous. In the next few slides, I'll focus on some of the barriers to connecting with land that the participants brought up, as well as some of the strategies they developed to ensure a strong relationship with the land. Some of the barriers to being on the land that participants mentioned include colonial land theft, urbanization, development, privatization, climate change, environmental contamination, conservation, risk of racism and violence, lack of transportation, and limited time and freedom to be on the land. Participants note that being disconnected from the land over generations has caused a collective loss of land-based knowledge, including how to identify, harvest, and prepare traditional foods and medicines for many in community. They said there was a loss of autonomy and a diminished ability to care for the land. To address these barriers, participants enter land sharing arrangements with band council, the local municipality, or private landowners. They create Indigenous-led community organizations to apply for and administer funding for land-based programming, and they utilize their Aboriginal rights to be on the land, for example, on reserve hunting and harvesting rights. Participants also emphasize the central importance of relationships with community members, nearby Indigenous communities, and non-Indigenous allies. They also practice and regain land-based knowledges informed by knowledge holders and Western science to support their environmental stewardship activities. Ongoing advocacy for Indigenous food sovereignty is needed, and Indigenous peoples need to be more involved in decision-making around food in Canada. Indigenous storytelling is also important, such as through the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission report that educated the public on the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada and the need for meaningful reparations. Finally, participants also discuss the immovable presence of spirit that connects them to the land wherever they are. They highlight the impact of living out their cultures as they develop strategies to be on the land. As one participant says, food sovereignty is the foundation of resurgence. If we can revitalize our food, we revitalize our people. Thank you, Miigwech Bisindayag.